Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series on U.S. involvement in World War II. Today I'm going to talk about late 1941 and early 1942 in the Pacific. Alright, so as I was saying in the last video, Japan is being cut off from its oil supply by the United States embargo. They decide they're going to go conquer the Dutch East Indies so that they can get oil. In order to get to the Dutch East Indies, they're going to have to take a bunch of other places in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including the Philippines, which are controlled by the United States. That means that the United States is going to be drawn into the war. So Japan decides that the United States is going to get involved. They're going to do it on their terms. They're going to do a preemptive strike against the United States. And so Japan decides that preemptive strike is going to be against the headquarters of the United States Pacific Fleet, which is headquartered at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is quite a ways from Japan, but Japan, they gather their navy, they gather their aircraft carriers, which is a new invention for World War II, and they set sail for Hawaii. All right. The attack on Pearl Harbor, though, it's important to remember, is part of a broader coordinated campaign. Japan attacks at all these different places simultaneously around the Pacific. It's one of, if not the most impressive, coordinated multiple attack like this in history that I'm aware of. And they really pulled off a pretty masterful stroke. So, in Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces show up on the morning of December 7th, 1941, which is early on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. Not much happening. The first wave of Japanese planes comes flying over. American radar operators mistake the radar blips for an incoming flight of American planes. No alarm is raised. The Japanese catch the authorities on Hawaii completely by surprise. They start bombing the ships at anchor in the harbor. And then a second wave and a third wave. And their main targets are the ships at anchor and the harbor, particularly the battleships at anchor along Battleship Row. These are some of the biggest and most powerful ships in the American Navy at that time. And they're just sitting ducks there in the harbor. They're also targeting, fuel storage facilities, and they're also targeting the United States Army Air Corps that has airplanes just sitting out in the open, parked on the runway at Hickam Field, now Hickam Air Force Base, right next to the harbor. The Americans are caught totally by surprise. There is some American response, but minimal. A few planes managed to get into the air to try to oppose the Japanese, but most of the planes are caught on the ground and destroyed. The attack on Pearl Harbor inflicted a lot of damage on the United States, just as the Japanese hoped it would. Not only were American servicemen killed with minimal losses to the Japanese, but also a number of ships were sunk. Several battleships on Battleship Row were sunk, and a number of smaller ships, and many airplanes were destroyed sitting out on the tarmac at Hickam Field. However, the one part of the plan that didn't work for the Japanese was, while they managed to sink some battleships and some smaller ships, they didn't get the aircraft carriers. The reason was that the American aircraft carrier fleet was not in Pearl Harbor that day. They had gone out to sea to do a training exercise. And so they weren't there when the Japanese showed up. So as a result, the American aircraft force was spared the beating at Pearl Harbor. And that would prove decisive 6 months later at the Battle of Midway. Anyway, get to that later. The news, of course, most of the rest of the country is hours ahead of Hawaii, so most Americans heard about the attack on the radio as they were getting ready for church or coming home from church that Sunday morning. President Roosevelt made a speech to Congress which is one of his better speeches. A December 7th, 1941, a date that shall live in infamy, the United States was deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan. In Roosevelt's patrician tones, he lists Japan's crimes and asks Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress votes almost unanimously. Imagine being the one senator who didn't vote for that. Votes almost unanimously in favor of war with Japan. The United States joins the Allies. Now, at the same time, Japanese forces also moved against Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and various Pacific islands, and not long after moved against the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. All of these attacks were astonishingly successful. Some places, like Hong Kong, fell within, I think, 72 hours. Singapore fell, didn't take much longer than that. The Dutch East Indies and the Philippines took a little bit longer, but not much. Particularly relevant to the United States was what happened in the Philippines, since the Philippines were still an American colony, so America was in charge of defending it. The man in charge of defending the Philippines was General Douglas MacArthur. You might remember that name from when we talked about the Bonus Army March back in 1932, because Douglas MacArthur was the one who sent tanks and bayonets against unarmed protesters on Anacostia Flats. Well, now he's in charge of defending the Philippines. But he doesn't have much to work with. He does not have the number of men or airplanes that he needs to defend the Philippines, and he has no naval coverage at all. Japanese forces land on the northern end of the main island in the Philippines, and they move southwards towards the center of the island where Manila is located. MacArthur and his forces retreat to a peninsula near Manila called the Bataan Peninsula, and they establish a series of defensive positions along the Bataan Peninsula. In early 1942, the Japanese start bashing their way through those defensive positions. MacArthur's men gradually are forced to retreat and retreat and retreat until they're right down at the very tip of the peninsula. They run out of peninsula. Then from the peninsula, they jump to a tiny island in the middle of Manila Bay called Corregidor. There's really nothing much on Corregidor except a single hill that has a cave in it. And some of the men were hiding in the cave, and the Japanese were just pounding this little island for all it was worth. The handwriting was on the wall that the American forces were not going to hold out. President Roosevelt did not want to lose General MacArthur. So Roosevelt, very conveniently for MacArthur, ordered him to escape. MacArthur, with not so much as a shred of reluctance, jumped in a motorboat and sped off into the night and escaped from the trap at Corregidor. As he splashed ashore in Australia, having escaped, he supposedly turns to those with him and says, "I shall return," said Douglas MacArthur, and, well, almost exactly 3 years later, he did. But talk about that later. There were a few others that escaped. There was a group of American nurses who were rescued because American forces couldn't bear to see female nurses fall into the hands of the Japanese. So a daring rescue was organized. The nurses were loaded onto an American submarine in the middle of the night and under cover of darkness, and managed to escape. But for the rest of MacArthur's soldiers left behind, there is no escape. Every single one of them, to a man, are either captured or killed by the Japanese. Those who are captured are marched on foot dozens of miles through tropical heat and humidity with little or no food or water to prison camp, where they are kept in horrible conditions for the rest of the war. This is referred to as the Bataan Death March, and a number of men died as a result of it who survived the fighting, but then they died from being just walking to the prison camp. As a result, the Japanese took the Philippines, and they consolidated their hold over the Philippines by the spring of 1942. MacArthur, though, vowed that he would return, and so did the American military. But the defeat on the Philippines was a very embarrassing blow to the United States military. Alright, in my next video, I am going to talk about what happens next in the summer and fall of 1942.